The first time I saw him, he was standing under the flicker of the hallway light outside my classroom, coffee in one hand, notebook pressed to his chest like a shield. The corridor smelled of chalk dust and rain-wet air. I remember thinking he looked far too self-possessed for someone so young, as if he already understood the quiet language of rooms like mine. Silence, precision, control. He caught my gaze for less than a second. It was enough. Something in that brief exchange unsettled me, a spark where there should have been none. "Graduate seminars start on time," I said, brushing past him. "Room 304. "Yes, Professor," he replied, the word carrying an unfamiliar steadiness. It wasn't defiance. It was awareness. I told myself I imagined it. Inside, the room filled with the small sounds of arrival, the scrape of chairs, the sigh of notebooks opening. I began the lecture I'd given a dozen times before: power, perception, and the unreliable narrator. Yet my rhythm faltered when I noticed him watching, not the board, but me. Not in the careless way students sometimes do when their attention drifts, but with a focus that felt personal. He wasn't admiring. He was reading. I kept my tone even, my gestures precise. I had built my career on that poise. Years of commanding lecture halls, committee rooms, and the quiet politics of academia had taught me that authority is a posture long before it's a title. When the seminar ended, he waited until everyone else had left. "You said in class that objectivity is a myth," he began. "Does that mean you don't believe in impartial truth?" The question was thoughtful, but his delivery carried something else. A quiet challenge, as if he wanted to see whether I'd flinch. "I believe truth exists," I said, gathering my notes. "We just edit it constantly," he smiled. "That sounds almost human." "Even professors are human, Mr. Reed." "Eli," he corrected gently. I paused, then nodded once. "Eli." He left with that faint, knowing smile, and I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending not to think about it. By the second week, I'd memorized the sound of his pen tapping against the desk, the way he tilted his head when he disagreed with a text. I'd also learned how to avoid looking at him for too long. It was safer that way. Every interaction had an edge. When he handed back the essay revisions I'd marked, our fingers brushed. A trivial accident. Still, the air shifted, an infinitesimal tremor that made me pull back too quickly. "Careful," he said, almost teasing. "Those margins bite." I laughed, something I rarely did in class. "They do when students forget to proofread," he grinned. "I'll take that as encouragement." Outside the university, my life was arranged and symmetrical. Neat apartment, morning runs, endless faculty emails. Yet his presence began to follow me home in small, uninvited ways. I'd hear his phrasing in my head while editing articles. I'd find myself lingering over the thought of his questions, sharp, unafraid, curious about everything I guarded most. The attraction wasn't about youth. It was about recognition. He carried the same restless energy I once had before I learned to hide it behind professionalism. One afternoon, he stayed after class again. Rain was falling hard against the windows, blurring the campus into watercolor. "You always end your lectures right before the best part," he said, smiling. "You stop when it feels like something important is about to happen." "Suspense is an academic technique," I replied, slipping papers into my bag. "Or a defense," he said quietly. The remark was bold, but not insolent. My pulse quickened anyway. "I'm not sure you're qualified to analyze your professor," I said. He shrugged. "Writers analyze what they can't have. Scholars too, maybe." That earned him a look I shouldn't have given, a look that admitted too much. He noticed. I saw the awareness flicker in his eyes before he stepped back. Respectful, careful. "Good night, Professor," he said, voice softer now. I watched him go, the echo of his footsteps dissolving down the hallway. The following week, our department hosted a small symposium. The room was crowded, the air thick with polite ambition. I spotted him across the room, no longer in student anonymity, but speaking to a visiting researcher, animated, confident. The sight stirred something I didn't want to name: pride, admiration, envy. When he noticed me watching, he raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement. I turned away. pretending to study a painting on the wall, but I felt his presence move closer through the crowd until he stood beside me. "You're avoiding me," he said, not accusingly. "I'm observing you," I corrected. "Is there a difference? In my world, yes. In mine, observation is participation." He was standing too near now, his voice low enough for only me to hear. I could smell the faint trace of cedar from his jacket, the warmth of wine on his breath. I told myself to step back. I didn't. Instead, I said, "You should be careful with statements like that. They sound like provocation. Maybe I'm testing a theory." "What theory?" "That control is an illusion." I looked at him then, really looked. His expression wasn't arrogant. It was honest, almost vulnerable. That was the danger. Sincerity wrapped in youth. Before I could reply, someone called his name. The spell broke. He smiled once, as if he'd said everything he needed to, and melted back into the crowd. After the event, I walked home alone through the drizzle. Streetlights reflected in puddles like scattered gold. My heels clicked against the pavement in a rhythm too quick, too defensive. In my apartment, I poured a glass of water and sat by the window. The city hummed below, indifferent. I told myself I was being foolish. He was just another student. Brilliant, yes, but transient like all of them. My role was to guide, not to be moved. But when I closed my eyes, I could still hear his voice. Control is an illusion. 2 days later, he sent an email. Subject line, about next week's reading. His message was perfectly appropriate. Questions about assigned chapters, a note of gratitude for feedback. Yet at the bottom, after his signature, he'd written one line that shouldn't have made my breath catch. Sometimes interpretation says more about the reader than the text. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. My answer was brief, professional, but when I pressed send, my hands trembled slightly. That night, I dreamed of ink spreading across a page, lines blurring until words became waves. When I woke, the taste of rain lingered in my mouth. The next seminar, he arrived early again. Only the two of us in the room. The air felt different, quiet but charged. He was setting up the projector when the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into semi-darkness. "Power outage," he said. I moved toward the window, half laughing. Apparently even the university needs a break. Maybe it's telling us to stop working. I turned to face him, light from the overcast sky falling across his face. There was no pretense this time, no deflection. Just a stillness between us. Honest, fragile, real. I opened my mouth to say something, anything. But the lights returned with a low hum, and the spell dissolved like mist. He smiled faintly. "Guess not." When the other students arrived, I carried on as if nothing had happened. But inside, something had shifted irrevocably. Because in that suspended second of darkness, I'd felt it. The truth neither of us could name. Whatever lived between us was no longer harmless. It began, as these things often do, not with a declaration but a silence that lasted too long. After that day, the power went out. Something fragile and wordless settled between us. A mutual awareness we both pretended not to notice. I taught, he listened, and yet every sentence seemed to hold a shadow meaning. Each pause between us felt like a secret the air itself was trying to confess. He started staying after class again, but now under the pretense of research discussions. Sometimes we spoke about the course, sometimes about books that had nothing to do with it, once about loneliness. It was on a Thursday evening, the building almost empty, rain pressing against the windows as if demanding entry. He asked me, "Do you ever get tired of being the one everyone expects to have answers?" I froze halfway through stacking papers. That's part of the job. That's not what I asked. The quiet between us was sharper than his words. I exhaled slowly. "Yes," I said finally. "Sometimes." He nodded as though he understood too well. "You don't have to carry everything all the time." I met his eyes then, and that was the first time I let him see it. The exhaustion, the wanting, The need to stop performing control. Something changed after that. He became gentler, but also bolder in small ways. A glance that lingered longer, a tone that carried warmth. He never crossed a line, but he began to trace its shape. In the weeks that followed, our conversations moved beyond the classroom. Sometimes we met in the university cafe, sitting across from each other with open books neither of us read. The pretense was thin, but necessary. He'd ask about my favorite writers, and I'd answer too carefully. He'd mention his plans for postgraduate research, and I'd offer advice with a composure I didn't feel. The distance we kept was precise and unbearable. One afternoon, he said something that nearly broke it. "You once told us that love, in literature, is an act of recognition. That it's not about newness, but remembering something you'd forgotten. Do you believe that?" "I did," I said, before I learned how much it complicates everything. "And now?" "Now," I murmured. "I try not to think about it." He smiled, but it wasn't teasing. "You sound like someone who's trying not to feel." I wanted to say that professors aren't supposed to feel this way about their students. I wanted to tell him that admiration and attraction often wear the same disguise, and that I was too old to mistake one for the other. But none of those words left my mouth. Instead, I said softly, "You should finish your thesis, Eli." He tilted his head. "That sounds like goodbye." "It's not. But it was. Or it should have been." A week later, rumors started. Small, harmless at first. I overheard 2 colleagues in the faculty lounge mention that I seemed closer to my advisees lately. Their tone was light, but I heard what they meant. By the end of the day, I'd drafted an email to reassign Eli to another advisor. It sat unsent in my drafts folder, a quiet betrayal I couldn't bring myself to complete. The next day, he noticed. "You're distracted," he said after class. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said quickly. Too quickly, he waited. "Then what is it?" I looked at him, really looked. He was no longer the boy who'd stood awkwardly in the corridor that first day. He'd grown into the space between us, steady, composed, and certain in ways that unnerved me. "You did nothing wrong," I whispered. "That's the problem." He stepped closer, still keeping the distance that professionalism demanded. "Then tell me what you want me to do." The question was simple, dangerous. It stripped away every layer of authority I'd built. I wanted to tell him to stop looking at me like that, like I was someone worth unraveling. Instead, I said, "Nothing, just stay careful." His gaze softened. "And you?" "I'll manage." But we both knew I wouldn't. The midterm symposium came again, a blur of faculty presentations, polite conversations, and academic pretense. He presented his paper flawlessly, his confidence magnetic. When he spoke about emotional authenticity in writing, I could barely breathe. Afterward, he found me by the exit. "Did you like it?" "You were brilliant," I said. "Everyone noticed, did you?" He didn't mean the paper. I hesitated, just long enough for the truth to spill into the silence. "I did." He smiled faintly, as if he'd been waiting to hear that. "Then I can stop pretending." "Pretending what?" "That I don't see you watching me." The words struck like an open secret finally spoken aloud. "I'm your professor," I said, the words brittle. "For now," he said quietly. I should have walked away. I didn't. The air between us pulsed with something neither of us could name. Not yet. Someone called my name from across the room. I turned, breaking eye contact, my heartbeat too loud in my ears. When I looked back, he was gone. The next day, I found a note slipped under my office door. "There's a cafe near the river, the one with the red awning. I'll be there at 6. You don't have to come." I spent the day convincing myself not to go. I told myself it would end everything I'd worked for. That it would confirm every suspicion whispered in hallways. That it was wrong. And yet, when the clock neared 6, I found myself walking toward the river. He was already there, waiting, 2 cups of coffee on the table. The evening light was soft, golden, the kind of light that forgives everything, "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "Neither did I." We sat in silence for a while, the city humming around us. Then he said, "I don't want to make things harder for you." "You already have," I said, smiling faintly. He looked down. "Then I'll stop." Something inside me tightened. The thought of him withdrawing, disappearing, the strange grief of restraint. "Don't," I said quietly. His eyes lifted to mine. "Then what do you want from me?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe just this, for a moment." The honesty was too much. Too naked. I looked away, but he didn't. He reached across the table, not touching, just close enough that his hand rested near mine. The space between us vibrated with everything unspoken. No touch, no words, just a shared breath in the fading light. And it was enough to undo me. After that evening, I started measuring time by our silences. We said less and felt more. In class, I'd sense him before I saw him, the weight of his gaze steady and unafraid. And though we spoke the same words as before, they carried different meanings now. When the semester neared its end, he submitted his final thesis, a study on emotional restraint in modern literature. His dedication read only, "For the one who taught me that silence can be louder than truth." I stared at the words for a long time, heart unsteady. He came to my office to return his library card. We talked about his next steps, graduate applications, future plans. The conversation was polite, measured, but when he turned to leave, he hesitated. "This is the last time I'll see you here," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Here." He nodded once, as if committing the word to memory. "Thank you, Professor." And then, after a heartbeat, quieter, "Thank you. For everything else, too." When the door closed behind him, I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The room felt both heavier and lighter at once. That night, I sat by my window, watching the city lights ripple across the glass. I thought about every rule I'd almost broken, every feeling I'd almost confessed. And for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of wanting. Because maybe surrender wasn't falling apart. Maybe it was finally allowing yourself to feel and still remain whole. Spring came back quietly, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. By then, the semester was over. The campus emptied of its noise and expectancy. My office had new advisees, my lectures new faces, but sometimes, between words on the board and the hum of fluorescent lights, I'd still think of him, of that charged, impossible space we'd shared. Eli Reed had graduated in winter. I attended the ceremony from the back of the hall, anonymous in the crowd of faculty gowns. He never saw me. When they called his name, he walked across the stage with the same unhurried confidence he'd always carried, and I felt something settle inside me in a kind of peace. Though tinged with loss, I told myself that was the end, that what we'd shared had been an intersection, brief but transformative, something that existed to be remembered, not repeated. For a while I believed it. Summer stretched long and golden. I threw myself into research, into conferences and manuscripts, into anything that kept my mind busy. But some absences refused to stay buried. They return in quiet moments, the sound of a turning page, the echo of laughter in an empty corridor, the faint scent of rain on stone. One afternoon, while reviewing essays at a cafe downtown, I caught sight of a familiar silhouette outside, tall, unhurried, hands in pockets. As if he'd walked out of memory, Eli. He hadn't seen me yet. He was older somehow, not in years, but in presence. The restless intensity I'd first noticed in him had settled into calm conviction. He ordered a coffee, turned, and our eyes met through the glass. Recognition hit like sunlight after a long storm. He smiled, the kind that starts small and grows only when it's returned. I didn't wave. I didn't need to. A moment later, he stepped inside. "Professor," he said softly, but the word no longer carried hierarchy. It was just a name from another life. "Eli," I replied. "It's been a while." "Almost a year," he said. "You look—" He stopped, searching for a word that wouldn't break the fragile air between us. "Exactly as I remember." "And you," I said, Don't. He smiled again, eyes warm. That's good, I think. We sat together. The conversation started politely, then gently unfolded, about his work, his travels, the city he'd moved to. He was writing now, part-time, teaching a class of his own. Do you like it? I asked. He nodded. Sometimes I hear myself giving advice you once gave me, about control and illusion. That advice was mostly for myself, I said, half laughing. I know, he said quietly. That's why it mattered. Outside, the light began to fade. That tender hour when the world softens and everything feels suspended. Our conversation slowed, and the silences became familiar again, comfortable. After a while, he asked, Did you ever regret it? How close we got? I looked out the window. Sometimes, but not for the reason you think. Then why? Because I was afraid of what it said about me, that I could still be moved. He considered that for a moment. Maybe that's the point of being moved. You're supposed to let it change you. I turned back to him. And you? Do you regret it? He shook his head. No. You taught me how to see people without needing to possess them. A pause. But I think part of me hoped we'd meet again, somewhere it wasn't forbidden. There was nothing calculated in his tone. Just truth, spoken softly. I felt something uncoil inside me, the old resistance loosening into acceptance. We left the cafe together and walked along the river, where the city lights trembled on the water. The evening air smelled of spring rain and distant jasmine. It's strange, I said. When I first met you, I thought control was everything. That power meant never needing anyone. And now? Now, I said. I think power is choosing who to trust with your softness. He smiled, looking ahead. Then maybe you were never in control to begin with. I laughed. A real laugh, one that felt like release. We reached the bridge, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence was no longer weighted. It was full, alive. He turned toward me. So what happens now? I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe we stop running from what's already changed. His expression softened. And if it changes again? Then we let it. He nodded, eyes shining in the fading light. And then, slow, unhurried, inevitable, he reached for my hand. No hesitation, no question. Just the quiet certainty of something finally allowed. The touch was simple, but it carried everything that had gone unsaid. Gratitude, recognition, the shared understanding that love doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. We walked like that until the city turned gold around us. Later, as twilight deepened, we sat by the water. I rested my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel divided between who I was and what I wanted. Do you think people can love twice? I asked. I think they can love better the second time, he said, when they stop pretending they don't know how. I smiled at that. The river moved quietly below, reflecting the soft shimmer of the city lights. Somewhere behind us, a musician played an old song on a violin, its melody drifting through the air like a benediction. He looked at me then, and I saw not the student I'd once tried to keep at arm's length, but the man he'd become, steady, kind, self-assured. You know, I whispered, you were the first person to make me question my own rules. He smiled. And you were the first to make me believe rules could be broken beautifully. I leaned closer, letting the moment breathe. No rush, no urgency, just peace. When the night finally fell, we stood and began to walk back. The air was cool, the world newly quiet. For years I'd believed surrender was weakness, that to let someone close was to lose part of yourself. But now, with his hand in mine, I understood. Surrender wasn't losing control. It was trust. It was release. It was coming home. As we crossed the bridge, lights rippling beneath us, I felt a small, certain truth settle in my chest. I had spent half my life teaching others how to read meaning into words. He had taught me how to read meaning into silence. And for the first time, that silence wasn't frightening. It was full of hope, of peace, of love freely chosen. If this story made you feel something, don't forget to like, comment, and follow. Tell me which moment stayed with you. The silence, the surrender, or the ending that finally felt like peace. Your thoughts keep stories like this alive.